A biting wind whipped across the icy expanse of northern Canada on a night when the full moon hung low and brilliant, turning every snowflake into a shard of silver and every shadow into a stage for lunacy. In a remote region famed for both its natural wonders and local legends, a motley group of ultra-wealthy trophy hunters had journeyed northward in their gleaming expedition vehicles. Enticed by the promise of rare game, stately horned deer and even a glimpse of the legendary polar bear. But what they found was something altogether more bizarre. A twisting rumor whispered among locals of a Wendigo that could don the guise of a deer, mimic the soft, persuasive tones of a human, and lure its prey into a trap so cunningly devious that it defied both logic and decency. On the outskirts of a glittering, frost-bitten forest, the hunters had set camp with all the trappings of modern luxury, a mobile base of high-tech contraptions, designer tents, and mechanized vehicles, all starkly incongruous with the ancient, savage beauty of the Arctic. As the hunters boasted and clinked glasses of expensive whiskey around crackling, controlled campfires, the pristine silence of the snowy wilderness was not as empty as it seemed. In the dense, dark woods just beyond the camp's perimeter, something stirred, a presence that slithered between the realms of myth and farce. Under the silver glow of the full moon, an absurd spectacle was about to unfold. The Wendigo, far from the terrifying, otherworldly demon of traditional lore, had somehow opted for a ludicrous disguise. At first, it appeared as a hunchbacked creature awkwardly attempting to mimic the gait of a deer. Its horns, crudely fashioned from what looked like mismatched antlers borrowed from a taxidermied buck left over from a rambling roadside attraction, wobbled precariously atop its head, with a lopsided smile and an almost apologetic twinkle in its eyes. The creature set off toward the camp, its every step accompanied by the faintest squeak, as if it were trying, and failing, to imitate a gentle, innocent deer. Meanwhile, not far off in the shadow of the forest, a small band of wild polar bears, accustomed to skirmishes over meager feasts of scavenged whale carcasses and scraps, ambled about in relative harmony. These bears, though fierce in nature, were not in the mood for a fight as they foraged contentedly for morsels amid the scattered remnants of a recent tide. Their solemn, lumbering movements painted a portrait of natural dignity, oblivious to the ludicrous drama slowly unfurling at the edge of their territory. Without warning, the Wendigo's carefully rehearsed ruse began to unravel in spectacular fashion. One of the wealthy hunters, enticed by the creature's seemingly docile, almost comical appearance, ventured a step beyond the sanctuary of the camp in pursuit of what he believed was a rare opportunity, a chance to capture on film this unusual deer. At that precise moment, the Wendigo, now growing impatient with its own farce, made a clumsy dash toward him. However, its timing was disastrously off. Instead of a graceful lunge, the creature tripped spectacularly on a hidden rock, causing it to tumble headlong into a thicket of low-hanging, frosted branches. The ensuing cacophony was absurd, a series of muffled grunts and an awkward flurry of limbs that had the surrounding animals pausing mid-snarl in confused amusement. In the ensuing chaos, several misadventures followed one after another like comedic dominoes. As one hunter attempted to sprint back to camp, he collided headfirst with a conveniently placed tree, sending his expensive gear scattering into the snow and leaving him dazed, with a stream of blood and a wildly disheveled mane. Simultaneously, one of the polar bears, confused by the sudden commotion, lunged at what it perceived to be a stray intruder, only to find itself clumsily entangled in the remnants of the overturned hunting vehicle. Another bear, seeking to join the fray, mistakenly swatted at the Wendigo's trailing tail, which resulted in the creature yelping as it recoiled, its antler disguise falling off like a cheap prop. Amid these farcical mishaps, the Wendigo, clearly losing its composure and its credibility as a fearsome killer, began to flail about wildly. Its attempts at swift, predatory movements devolved into a series of slapstick pratfalls as it repeatedly collided with frozen snowbanks and tangled itself in creeping vines. Its grotesque, misfitting disguise now seemed more comical than horrifying, a tragic parody of its intended menace. The hunters, caught between fear and disbelief, could scarcely comprehend the surreal tableau unfolding before them. Their initial shouts of terror soon mingled with bursts of incredulous laughter, as the absurdity of the situation warred with the instinct to flee from potential danger. Then came the twist that would alter the farce into an even more chaotic climax. As the hunters' panic reached a fever pitch, one of the polar bears, a large, battle-scarred matriarch with eyes that held both fierce determination and an almost conspiratorial glint, noticed the true danger that lurked beneath the madness. Rather than joining in the pointless pursuit of the hapless Wendigo, she turned her attention to a much more significant threat: the unwitting victim caught in the middle of this absurd chase. A hapless soul whose continuous runs and panicked screams were drawing the attention of both beasts. With a series of bellowing roars that blended fierce protectiveness with a hint of exasperated humor, the matriarch charged toward the fleeing victim, inadvertently saving them from the clutches of both the bumbling Wendigo and the misguided hunters. In that moment of riotous intervention, the dynamics of the chase shifted dramatically. The confused victim, a hapless middle-aged man with a penchant for luxury and a bewildered expression permanently etched on his face, found himself in the midst of an impossible trinity. He was being chased not only by a wildly inept Wendigo in disguise but also by a protective polar bear that now seemed to be playing the role of both guardian and inadvertent comic relief. As he darted through the snow, his frantic footsteps echoed like a slapstick interlude from a forgotten cartoon. While the Wendigo, tripping over its own grotesque form, and the bear, occasionally pausing as if to shake its head in mild disgust, created a spectacle of absurd proportions. Throughout this madcap chase, the landscape itself played its part in the dark comedy. The endless, sunlit ice fields provided a brilliant, unyielding backdrop where every mishap was accentuated by the stark, vibrant clarity of nature. Sunlight danced off glistening snow, turning every fallen object and spilled bucket of hunting gear into a glittering prop in this bizarre theatrical production. The natural elements seemed almost amused by the chaos. A light breeze would scatter the errant feathers from a broken hat, and a stray ray of sunshine would illuminate a moment of calamitous pratfall in vivid, almost surreal detail. As the chase reached its most feverish, the Wendigo and the polar bear became locked in a clumsy duel. The creature's attempts to assert its predatory prowess were repeatedly thwarted by the bear's powerful counterattacks, which, despite their natural savagery, were tinged with an absurdity that bordered on farce. One moment, the Wendigo lunged with a shriek that should have instilled terror. The next, it found itself inexplicably tangled in a cluster of frosty branches, its antlers clattering to the ground like absurd ornaments. Nearby, the victim, now sufficiently harried and delirious, stumbled upon a snowmobile, a discarded relic of an earlier, more organized expedition, only to be swept along in a wild, uncontrollable joyride that sent him careening across the open ice in a series of involuntary somersaults that elicited peals of laughter even from his terrified companions. Finally, as the chaos crescendoed into a series of mishaps that defied the very logic of horror and appealed instead to an outrageous, slapstick sense of humor, a surreal moment of reluctant truce emerged. Exhausted by their relentless bungling, both the polar bear and the Wendigo paused mid-conflict. Their eyes, one pair fierce with centuries of raw wilderness instinct and the other flickering with the confused, disappointed resignation of a failed masquerade, met in a brief, silent moment. The bear's head tilted as if in a dramatic, exasperated sigh, while the Wendigo emitted a long, drawn-out groan, a sound that was more comedic than fearsome. In that instant, the absurdity of the night crashed down on everyone, the hunters, the victim, and even the creatures themselves. Realizing that the frenetic chase had achieved nothing but mutual exhaustion and that their prey was now making a desperate escape, the surviving hunters scrambled toward a waiting helicopter that had, by some quirk of fate or fortune, been poised for extraction. With a mixture of relief and disbelief, the hapless victim clambered aboard, his final glance back at the scene a blend of bewilderment and reluctant admiration for the chaotic natural order. As the helicopter's rotors sliced through the frigid air, the polar bear, still with an air of indignant grace despite a few grazed patches and a rueful twitch of its snout, fixed its gaze on the receding figure of the Wendigo. The creature, too, seemed to pause, its form slack and its once ferocious demeanor reduced to a slump of defeated theatrics, as if the night's chaotic duel had drained its malefic energy. In a final, almost farcical display, the polar bear gave one last, indignant glare in the direction of the Wendigo, with a dismissive snort that could only be interpreted as a mix of hunger and exasperation. It shuffled away from the battleground, a comedic retreat from a contest it had seemingly lost interest in. The Wendigo, caught in a state of confusion and overwhelming fatigue, let out a guttural growl that hardly resembled the victorious cry one might expect from a fearsome predator. In the end, the victim's daring escape, the tragicomic misadventures of the Wendigo, and the polar bear's flippant, almost indifferent departure painted a picture of nature's unpredictable humor, a dark, ironic twist on the hunt that revealed the eternal truth: when the wild takes center stage, even terror can become a spectacle of absurdity. As the full, cold light of dawn broke over the horizon, dispersing the chaotic remnants of the night into the soft glow of a new day, the scene settled into an uneasy calm. The polar bear and the Wendigo, two forces that had clashed in a night of bewildering, unintentional comedy, remained scattered across the vast wilderness. Whether the Wendigo would recover its cursed dignity or simply vanish into the shadowed recesses of the forest was left to the uncertain whispers of legend. All that remained were bittersweet memories etched into the snowy ground and the grim realization among the hunters that the pursuit of monstrous trophies had led not only to an encounter with nature's most capricious denizens but also to a moment of self-reflection, a dark comedy of errors that exposed the folly of humankind's blind pursuit of status at the expense of the natural world. In the aftermath, as the helicopter receded into the distance and the surviving hunters gathered their gear with heavy hearts and wry smiles, an unspoken message settled over the melting expanse: perhaps, just perhaps, the wild was not merely a theater for our conquest but a stage where nature's own humor reigned supreme. The absurdity of the night, marked by mishaps, mistaken identities, and the ridiculous bravado of both man and beast, left an indelible lesson that even in a world overrun by fear and darkness, there might be a glimmer of levity in acknowledging our own predatory impulses. A final, shared glance between the surviving hunters and a lone polar bear on the horizon seemed to say it all: that in the end, nature would always find a way to rebalance itself, even if that rebalancing involved a dark, absurd twist of fate that left us questioning who really was the hunter and who was the prey. Under a sky twinkling with the mischievous light of a full moon, the stage was set for an evening that defied both horror and reason. The wealthy hunters, still reeling from the bizarre disappearance of a few of their number earlier that night, had reluctantly begun a frantic pursuit after an elusive figure they believed to be a prize specimen. Their boots crunched over the sparkling snow as they fumbled with their high-end firearms, their confident voices now mixed with panicked whispers. In the distance, the Wendigo, disguised in a haphazard patchwork of deer antlers and a half-finished human mask, ambled with all the awkwardness of an actor who had forgotten his lines, its every step accompanied by an unintentionally silly squeak. It had apparently resolved to lure the hunters deep into a maze of frosted pines by mimicking the gentle, soothing timbre of a familiar voice, promising the presence of an exceptional trophy. Meanwhile, a small band of polar bears, usually reticent in their solitary glories, had congregated near an abandoned piece of driftwood that oddly resembled a makeshift banquet table. Gathered around the spoils of an accidental whale carcass, their normally fearsome majesty was softened by a peculiar air of bemusement. Perhaps the absurd presence of the faux deer Wendigo had stirred something unexpected within them. As one particularly lanky polar bear ambled forward to inspect a dangling piece of antler from the Wendigo's disguise, it inadvertently collided with the creature. In an explosion of disarray, limbs flailed, antlers clattered, and both bear and beast tumbled head over paws through the pristine snow. The Wendigo's clumsy fall elicited an unintentionally comic shriek, a sound that echoed through the forest like a cross between a choked whine and a cartoonish honk. Within moments, the chaotic chase became a madcap free-for-all. The hunters, now split between pursuing the erratically wandering Wendigo and attempting to rescue their stumbling comrades, dashed across the ice in a bewildering race. One hunter, tripping over an exposed cable, landed face first into a snowbank, his extravagant winter gear disappearing beneath a heap of powdery white. Another, armed but terrified, fired a round that ricocheted off a snowmobile and ended up decorating a nearby tree with an imprint resembling an off-brand holiday ornament. Amid the confusion, the Wendigo, still disoriented from its earlier collision, staggered about as if trying to regain its dignity. Its clumsy attempts to mimic the graceful gait of a deer now came off as wildly out of sync, provoking incredulous laughter from a few of the onlooking hunters even as fear flickered in their eyes. Meanwhile, the polar bear pack, often known for their stoic independence, displayed an extraordinary, if entirely accidental, episode of teamwork, drawn together by the absurd turmoil. Two of the bears exchanged a series of bewildered glances before deciding, almost instinctively, that their shared feast and territorial right must be defended. They lumbered forward in a haphazard formation, their roars merging into a cacophonous duet that seemed at once intimidating and inexplicably comical. With thick, padded paws, they attempted a coordinated pounce on the flailing Wendigo. Yet the hybrid monster, its deer disguise now in shambles and its mismatched features barely hanging on, reacted with a series of frantic, uncoordinated swipe attempts. In one particularly farcical moment, one bear's claw caught a loose piece of the creature's tattered mask, sending it spinning like a top, much to the ensuing amusement and horror of everyone present. Amid these absurd clashes, the scene grew even more surreal as a group of hapless tourists, lost and terrified, became unwilling extras in this carnivalesque nightmare. They darted between trees and slid along icy slopes in a slapstick escape that resembled a low-budget cartoon chase. One tourist, in a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, commandeered a discarded snowmobile and careened wildly across the scene, performing such erratic somersaults that even the most jaded viewers might have found it bordering on performance art rather than sheer terror. As the melee escalated, the Wendigo attempted another predatory maneuver with grandiose theatrical flair. It lunged once more, this time aiming directly at one of the smaller, nimble polar bear cubs that had wandered a few steps away from the pack. The cub, startled out of its innocent reverie by the sudden intrusion, let out an ear-splitting yelp that sent shivers down the spine of every creature present. In a twist of unlikely alliances, one of the adult bears, compelled by an instinct to protect its vulnerable kin, barreled forward with such force that it inadvertently launched itself into the Wendigo. The collision was a mad, over-the-top spectacle. The Wendigo's misdirected bite landed on the bear's tail instead of its body, while the bear's furious charge sent both parties into a tangled, flailing heap on the icy ground. The resulting chaos was punctuated by a series of stunned, almost comedic, silence followed by collective gasps and a few reluctant chuckles. As the furious tussle wore on, the boundaries between predator and farce blurred. The hunters, no longer sure whether to fight, flee, or simply film the spectacle, began to realize that the real adversary was not the polar bear, which displayed only a bewildered, if protective, ferocity, but the hapless Wendigo, whose entire premise of terror had unraveled into ridiculous incompetence. In a climactic moment filled with both horror and absurdity, the Wendigo's arms flailed wildly, its antlered head wobbling as it tripped over its own limbs. A particularly hefty polar bear seized the opportunity, delivering a resounding swipe that sent the creature sprawling helplessly across the snow. The Wendigo let out a final, ridiculously pitiful groan that echoed off the ice, a sound more akin to a disgruntled cartoon villain than a fearsome, ancient predator. In that moment of chaotic pause, both beast and man caught their breath. The polar bears retreated slightly, seemingly shaking their heads as if to say, "Enough is enough," while the surviving hunters exchanged exasperated looks, their hearts still pounding in a mixture of terror and incredulity. The hapless tourists, having narrowly escaped on the commandeered snowmobile, began to murmur nervously about the night's inexplicable sequence of events, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or sprint away in disbelief. As the bright Arctic dawn approached, dispersing the remaining shadows with its gentle, revealing light, the Wendigo, now a crumpled, disoriented, and rather pitiful figure, slumped into a snowbank, its feeble groans mingling with the polar bear's low, rumbling bellows. There, In the clearing, the chaos subsided into an almost surreal stillness, a pause that underscored the absurdity of what had transpired. The hunters, who had once set out with visions of trophy conquests, now stood perplexed and introspective, their ambition tempered by the realization that nature's wild stage was unpredictable and often downright ludicrous. Thus, beneath a sky washed in the soft hues of early morning, the chaotic night of the absurd chase left an indelible imprint on all who witnessed it. The polar bears resumed their scattered, solitary roaming as if to reclaim dignity in the wake of their accidental heroism. The Wendigo, humiliated by its own bungling and perhaps left to nurse its wounded pride, slinked back toward the deeper, shadowed forest, its future uncertain and its threat now as much the subject of dark humor as of genuine dread. And the hunters, having experienced an encounter that defied all expectations, vowed to abandon their ruthless pursuit of macabre trophies, realizing, with a mix of relief and chagrin, that in the wild tapestry of nature, sometimes the most dangerous predators are not those one expects, but those who, in their folly, expose the absurdity inherent in humankind's desire for domination. Under a sky painted with the bruised hues of early dawn, the landscape of what was once a mighty, unbroken ice expanse now resembled a shattered mosaic. The mobile research station, once the heart of a determined scientific effort to freeze and preserve the gene pool of polar bears, stood precariously on a sliver of ice that trembled with the weight of a transformed world. Inside, exhausted scientists worked with feverish urgency among failing generators and flickering monitors, their every effort dedicated not only to preserving life in the form of carefully extracted bear embryos, but to fighting back against a creeping dread that had seeped in from the darkened edges of the ravaged wilderness. For months, the team had battled the consequences of climate collapse, the gradual melting of the Arctic, the encroachment of saline seas upon former ice, and the collateral damage of human ambition. They had seen their painstaking work threatened by the very forces they sought to contain. And now, amid their desperation and dwindling supplies, a sinister truth emerged from the dim corridors of ancient legend, the Wendigo. That cursed spirit of unfathomable hunger and despair had never truly been vanquished. Born in the forgotten epics of indigenous lore and fueled by the ruin of human civilization, it had slithered from the icy depths of the uncharted forest. In its spectral form, tinged with the bitter remnants of lost dreams, the Wendigo had grown bolder and hungrier with each passing day, drawing near on silent, predatory wanes. It began in the dead of night when the station's alarms shattered the tentative calm. A low, unholy hum vibrated through the corridors, and equipment essential to the cryogenic preservation process faltered and died. Amid the mounting chaos, terrified scientists discovered that several colleagues had vanished, their final moments marked by inexplicable signs, drips of cold blood, inexplicable claw marks on metal panels, and shredded remnants of lab coats scattered like fallen snow. Outside, the bitter wind carried the unmistakable stench of decay and lost civilization, as if the very air were corrupted. In that moment, it became clear that the Wendigo had breached the station, its presence a dark echo of human greed and ancient malediction. Driven by sheer desperation, the remaining team resolved on one final gambit. They had been tracking one last wild polar bear, a creature tagged for conservation that had become a symbol of nature's enduring, if fragile, spirit. The hypothesis was daring and fraught with peril. If they could free this magnificent animal from its containment and enable its natural instincts to awaken, perhaps it could rally the last vestiges of wild power to repel the cursed Wendigo. Under the eerie glow of emergency lights and against the backdrop of a dissolving icefield, the scientists quickly disabled the high-tech security mechanisms and opened the reinforced chamber. Out lumbered the polar bear, gaunt from starvation, its once majestic fur now matted and patchy, yet its eyes still glimmering with the ferocity of ancient winters. For a heartbeat, as if recognizing the gravity of its newfound mission, the beast regarded its would-be saviors with an intensity that transcended the cold science of the day. Outside the fragile perimeter, the Wendigo advanced, its form, half translucent and wreathed in a ghostly chill, stalked through the corridors of the ruined station and along the crumbling ice with a deliberate, predatory cadence. Every step it took left jagged fissures on the surface, and every unearthly cry resonated like a lament for lost worlds. The confrontation was inevitable, under the relentless pressure of a storm of bitter winds and a sky that bore the sorrow of a ruined earth. A fateful clash erupted on a thin stretch of unstable ice, a final arena where nature's defiant guardian and the ancient curse would determine the uncertain future. The polar bear, imbued now with the desperate hope of the scientists and the enduring legacy of its wild ancestors, surged forward with a roar that shook the very foundations of the melting ground. Its massive paws thundered against the ice, sending tremors and shards of glistening frost scattering into the cold air. The Wendigo met the bear head-on. In that moment, an almost preternatural silence fell over the tumultuous battlefield, a silence heavy with the weight of all that had been lost and all that might yet be saved. The bear's jaws snapped with the raw power of a creature that had weathered countless epochs of the Arctic's cruel majesty. And its eyes, deep pools of untamed defiance, locked onto the haunting, cursed gaze of the Wendigo. The ensuing struggle was a monstrous ballet of primal instinct and accursed malice. The Wendigo, its spectral form flickering as if flickering between realms, lashed out with claws that raked through the bear's scarred hide. The polar bear countered with mighty swipes, each impact echoing like the drumbeat of ancient war songs across the desolate ice. For long, the two forces battled as the fragile ice beneath them creaked under the strain, each powerful lunge and every savage bite a testament to nature's desperate, unyielding will to survive. Yet even as the battle raged, a bitter irony unfolded. The very instability of the ice, the physical manifestation of climate collapse, became the ultimate arbiter. With every thunderous impact, the surface groaned and fractured, and in a cataclysmic moment that seemed to suspend time itself, the ice trembled beyond its breaking point. Cracks snaked through the frozen plain like the veins of a wounded giant, and a deafening roar of shattering ice merged with the terrible sounds of the clash. In that final, fateful instant, both the polar bear and the Wendigo were sent tumbling into a violent plunge, swept away by the frenzied collapse into the dark, icy abyss of the thawing sea. For a time, all that remained was the haunting silence of the polar twilight, a silence punctuated only by the ragged, desperate breaths of the survivors inside the station and the quiet, mournful whispers of indigenous elders recounting the legends of old. The scientists, still huddled behind shattered windows and amid the flickering hope of emergency lights, could only watch in impotent horror as nature's delicate, irreversible balance shifted once more. Had the mighty polar bear, a living relic of the wild's majestic power, truly vanquished the ancient, cursed spirit of the Wendigo? Or had the malevolent force merely been forced into a temporary slumber within the crushing depths of the dark, churning sea, awaiting, as all deep curses do, the next opportunity to rise when human greed reopened its blighted wounds? As the first tentative rays of a reluctant dawn began to chase away the remnants of darkness, those few who had survived emerged onto the reconstituting ice, a landscape scarred by battle and sorrow, yet holding a fragile promise of renewal. Indigenous elders gathered in solemn reflection, their voices low and laden with the wisdom of innumerable generations. They vowed to pass on the anguished lesson that this shattered world had taught, that the relentless, corrupting power of human ambition could awaken ancient curses, and that unless nature's balance were respected above all else, even the cold heart of the Arctic would bear witness to further tragedies. And so, with hearts heavy and minds haunted by the images of that terrible night, a night where the roar of a polar bear and the cursed lament of the Wendigo merged into one eternal, ambiguous dirge, the final chapter of Polar Bear and Wendigo, Ki Yuk Nu Dong Trong Tuong Lai Hao Tan the, came to a close. The fate of the polar bear, that solitary beacon of nature's enduring spirit, and the fate of the vengeful Wendigo, a dark reminder of the sins that mar our world, remained shrouded in uncertainty. The survivors left that shattered outpost with an unyielding promise to rebuild, to restore the balance that had been disrupted, and to carry forward the ancient truth, that the true legacy of a world undone by greed is not merely the despair of its passing, but the whispered hope that nature may yet reclaim its rightful, untamed glory. Under the pale light of a reluctant dawn, the remnants of a once stalwart mobile research station trembled on the edge of a battered, melting ice field. Here, Scientists and indigenous survivors had long clung to the dream of preserving the polar bear, a living symbol of wild, untamed nature, even as climate change and human greed had ravaged the land. The station's corridors, scarred with broken equipment and echoing with the hurried steps of those desperately trying to defy extinction, bore silent testimony to a time when modern ambition tried to wrest nature's wonders from oblivion. Yet even as engineers worked frantically to secure frozen archives of bear embryos and track the few living polar bears wandering across collapsing ice, an ancient terror loomed in the shadows, the Wendigo, a cursed specter nurtured on the despair and ruins of humankind. Across the shattered expanse, only a meager number of polar bears still roamed, ghosts of a bygone era moving slowly over isolated patches of ice that bobbed uncertainly above a dark, churning sea. These wild survivors, gaunt from hunger and the relentless toll of a broken environment, had long been revered by indigenous voices as the guardians of nature's fading legacy. Their eyes, though shadowed by hardship, still held a spark of primordial defiance, a quiet promise that even in a world overrun by desolation, the spirit of the wild could endure. It was upon such a precarious stage that the Wendigo began its relentless hunt. Emerging from the tattered fringes of a once sacred forest, the cursed entity, its gaunt form a grotesque fusion of ancient malice and the residual vigor of past conquests, stalked across the broken ice. It moved with a spectral agility honed over centuries, a creature whose presence exuded a palpable chill and whose every step left deep scars on the fragile surface below. Fed by the collapse of civilization and the ever-present, festering seeds of human greed, the Wendigo's hunger had become insatiable, its dark energy growing with each passing day as it sought to claim any remnant of life. Then, amid the desolation and the desperate efforts of the research station, chaos came to a head. On a bitter, wind-swept morning when the horizon was a blurred tapestry of breaking ice and dark, endless water, the cursed entity breached the perimeter of the station. Alarm bells shrieked through frost-bitten corridors as its unholy presence slithered into the heart of the fragile sanctuary. Scientists, whose minds had grown numb to the constant battle for survival, were thrown into a frenzied scramble. Equipment malfunctioned, powerful cryogenic systems sputtered and died, and several lives were lost in the ensuing melee as the Wendigo tore mercilessly through the station's defenses, a dark echo of humanity's own collapse. In the midst of the terror, the research team made a fateful, desperate decision. Their last hope rested on an aging polar bear, its flanks marked with the scars of endless hardship, its spirit still flickering with the ancient fire of the wild. Tagged and tracked for conservation, this creature had become an inadvertent symbol of nature's enduring resilience, with trembling hands and hearts heavy with both fear and fragile hope. The surviving scientists disabled its containment system, releasing the animal onto the treacherous ice. It emerged with a slow, determined gait, its eyes a deep reservoir of unspoken history, a silent vow to protect what remained of a natural world on the brink of annihilation. What followed was a scene of surreal confrontation, a final, desperate duel in which nature's fading champion and the ancient, cursed Wendigo clashed on a stage of fragile ice that groaned under the weight of both. The polar bear, driven by a primal instinct that transcended the ravages of time and hunger, charged into the darkness with a guttural roar that seemed to summon the echoes of countless winters. Its massive paws pounded the fragile ice as it lunged at the Wendigo, which responded with an unearthly screech that sent vibrations racing through the frozen earth. The two forces collided in a cataclysm of shattered ice and bitter, relentless fury, a struggle that pounded out an ancient rhythm, like the heartbeat of the world itself fighting against the endless decay wrought by human neglect. The battlefield was a chaotic symphony of clashing roars and fragmented ice. Every powerful swipe of the bear's mighty paw sent fissures racing across the surface, while every ghastly, incoordinated thrust from the Wendigo etched dark scars into the land. The polar bear fought with a raw, desperate determination, each attack echoing the storied past of its ancestors, majestic creatures of a wild and untamed Arctic that had once roamed free in endless numbers. The Wendigo, its spectral form contorting as if torn between realms, retaliated with a savage intensity born of ancient malediction. Its claws, sharp and merciless, slashed at the bear with spectral precision. Fueled by a hunger that was both unending and insidiously poetic, a dark counterpoint to nature's enduring beauty. As the duel raged on, the very environment bore witness to the ancient struggle. The ice, already in a state of fragile decay, trembled under the sheer force of the confrontation. Cracks snaked outward like the deep scars of a broken heart, and the distant, mournful howl of the ocean mingled with the cries of battle. The scientists and indigenous survivors, hidden in the fragile safety of the remaining station and on precarious outcroppings of ice, watched in hushed terror and awe. Their eyes spoke of a quiet, terrible wonder, a realization that the outcome of this primal contest could determine the fate of all life in this ravaged world. Then, in a moment charged with a profound mix of sorrow and defiant hope, the unyielding spirit of nature surged forth. With one massive, earth-shattering charge, the polar bear drove its powerful frame into the Wendigo's spectral form. The Wendigo's eyes flared with a final, anguished malice, and its cry, a sound that merged the lament of lost civilizations with the fury of a vengeful curse, resounded over the shattered ice. In that instant, the unstable ice beneath them, weakened by the unrelenting assault of time and the ravages of a broken climate, convulsed with a deafening crack. A cascade of fractured ice swept across the battlefield, an apocalyptic shower of glittering shards that heralded the collapse of nature's precarious stage. In a violent, final crescendo, both the polar bear and the Wendigo were hurled into a swirling vortex of tumultuous water and shattered ice. For several harrowing moments, as they plunged into the dark, churning abyss of a once frozen sea, the fate of the ancient curse and nature's defiant spirit hung suspended in a maelstrom of uncertainty. Beneath the cold, indifferent waves, the polar bear's mighty form fought with every last vestige of its ancestral vigor, while the Wendigo's spectral essence flickered uncertainly, a dark promise of eventual return, or a final defeat swallowed by nature's inexorable cycle of renewal. When the turbulent chaos finally subsided, the broken remnants of the battlefield lay scattered across a landscape bathed in the fragile light of a new day. Survivors emerged, scientists with hearts heavy with grief and indigenous elders whose voices carried the timeless weight of ancient prophecy. They gathered in a solemn, tear-streaked vigil on the edge of what remained of the research station, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the battered ice met a vast, uncertain sea. In hushed tones and with tearful reverence, they recounted the night's terrible struggle, a night when nature's last guardian fought with an indomitable spirit against a cursed entity born of human transgression. They spoke of a battle not simply for survival, but for the very soul of the wild, a struggle that embodied the eternal conflict between the profound majesty of the natural world and the relentless hunger of greed and cruelty. Indigenous elders murmured ancient warnings, that as long as the human heart reveled in exploitation and neglect, ancient curses such as the Wendigo would never truly be vanquished, but would lurk in the dark crevices of the earth, waiting for the next chance to rise. As the pale light of dawn grew stronger, casting soft, hopeful hues over the ravaged, trembling landscape, the survivors set forth with heavy hearts and an unyielding pledge to rebuild. They vowed to restore the delicate, eternal balance of a world scarred by modern sin, to honor the quiet, enduring power of the wild, and to forever remember the tragic, ambiguous legacy of that fateful night. The polar bear, a fading, yet awe-inspiring symbol of nature's undying resilience, had fought valiantly. And although its final fate remained shrouded in the mysteries of the deep, its defiant roar would echo eternally through the shattered ice, a reminder that even amid relentless adversity, there remains a spark of hope for renewal. Thus, as the survivors departed from the remnants of that haunted station and stepped into a future uncertain but yearning for redemption, the saga of Polar Bear and Wendigo, Ki Yuk Nu Dong Trong Tuong Lai Hao Tan The, was etched indelibly into the icy tapestry of the Arctic, a somber, everlasting parable that warned, the wild can be reclaimed, but the price of human greed is a legacy of darkness that may never truly fade away.